Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Historical Thoughts and Interpretations podcast. As always, I'm your host, Christian Massar, and today I'll actually be doing another interview. Today's guest is Professor Natalia Telepneva. She is a lecturer in international history at the University of Strathclyde. Her specialty is the Cold War era Soviet Union and socialism with a specific focus on Africa. And today we will discuss her first book, Cold War Liberation, the Soviet Union and the Collapse of the Portuguese Empire in Africa, 1961 to 1975, in which she details the roles of Soviet and even Czechoslovak bureaucrats and spies in the anti-colonialist wars in Portugal's African colonies of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. We will talk about what connected the Soviet Union with the local independence movements, how the communist Soviet government supported Marxism-inspired leaders in Portuguese Africa, and how the anti-colonial wars played out. You may download her book as a free ebook through the link which I will provide in the show notes. Let's get right into it. Professor Telepneva, it's an honor to have you on the podcast. Thank you for coming on today.
Hi, it's very good to finally meet you.
It's very good to meet you too. So if you don't mind, I would just like to ask a little bit about yourself and the project, kind of give an intro to your project, like kind of your personal background, professional background, projects you've worked on in the past, and your interest in such projects. What is your background basically?
Yes, my name is Natalia Telepneva. I'm originally from Russia, and I came to this country when I was a teenager, basically, and then started after university, started working on my PhD, which concerned from the start Soviet relations with the liberation movements in the former Portuguese colonies, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, which later on developed into a book project that was published last year by University of North Carolina Press called Cold Liberation. So this project basically tells the story of Soviet relations between with the liberation movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. But it's ultimately a bigger project that uses the lens of these relationships to talk about bigger themes about Soviet relations with African countries and also the Cold War in Africa more generally.
Okay, that's very good. And what kind of made you want to do this work? Like every time, when we're talking about academic work, right? We always want our research to fill a hole somewhere. So what was the research hole that you wanted to fill in, so to speak, with your PhD and with your work? Like what was the kind of like, how was this research, this work important in the kind of the field of Cold War studies in Africa and African studies and so on?
Yes, I think my original interest was, part of it was a little bit personal, part was professional, because my grandfather, he was a Soviet Jew who also went through the Second World War as a Red Army officer. And he would tell me, the stories of him experiencing basically when he would meet with the Americans on the Elbe, and this kind of mythologized stories, but about racism in the United States and kind of the racism that he saw in the American army, and basically juxtaposing that kind of experience with his own anti-racism, which I believed was very genuine. And of course, at the time in the 1990s, there was a lot of actually backlash against immigrants from Central Asia in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was something he was really much against, and he believed in this kind of internationalism, and he was an internationalist sort of mindset that he had. So that was very appealing to me, and of course I had a very close personal relationship with him. So I was always interested in Soviet anti-racism, which sort of led me to explore Soviet relations with Africa. And I thought, of course, initially when I started, I knew very little about, colonies or any of that stuff, but I was generally interested in support for kind of anti-imperialism, anti-racism in the USSR. And when I first, many years ago, started this work, what I wanted really to understand is why the Soviet Union got involved in the Angolan Civil War and supporting one of the nationalist groups, the MPLA.
MPLA, yeah.
In Angola. So this is the story that there was at the time in 2000s. There was a lot of debate around, the role of the Soviets versus the Cubans and how that whole story panned out. And I basically wanted to understand kind of the prehistory of that high point in the Soviet interventions that led me to look at the relations with liberation movements before 1975, which was when Angola finally became independent.
And Mozambique too, I believe, 1975.
Yes, Mozambique too.
Yeah, Mozambique too. Oh, okay. So kind of looking into the prehistory and the background of it. Okay, definitely, very good. So like talking about the research, like again, plugging in the holes in research, you mentioned in your book, in the introduction, that the quote, literature on South Africa is substantial. But the with anti-apartheid and stuff, like certainly growing up in the Western world, like we hear a lot more about South Africa and apartheid and Nelson Mandela and so on, and a little bit about African National Congress and stuff. But about Mozambique, like just this is anecdotal, but my wife her background is from that area, from Mozambique, and she's the first Mozambican person I've ever met. So it's quite interesting. So it kind of shows so what you mentioned about literature on South Africa is there's a lot more that makes a lot of sense. But so you mentioned that there's not as much history written about Portugal's African colonies. So aside from language, perhaps, what's the big difference between studying, nationalist movements in Angola, Mozambique, and, versus South Africa, or like even Zimbabwe, Kenya, and even the French, French speaking movements in Africa too? What were some of the big differences you noticed?
Yes, I think this is a complex issue, and the answer would not be one single answer. I think as any discipline, part of it is to do with resources and access, because in the Anglo-Saxon English-speaking academia, of course, there's always been more connection to, say, South Africa, or in England, where I'm currently based, to East Africa. Perhaps more interested, obviously, in Mau, Kenya, and in South Africa. Of course, it's really important country. Also from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint, fascinating history. Very, very difficult, violent one of apartheid. So I understand why people are naturally drawn to look at South Africa, and such a complicated story. African National Congress, Mandela, these are the things, as you said, that people know a lot about, maybe more are passionate about, interested in. So on one hand. On the other hand, of course, there's a little bit more access to archives. You have fairly decent access and a range of archives in Pretoria, and perhaps even in Cape Town, so kind of Johannesburg. So there's a bit more archival access than, say, in Mozambique or Guinea-Bissau and Angola, probably the most complicated, also politically, where there's still dominance of one party, basically, that had controlled the liberation movement. And this is a much more authoritarian regime than, say, in South Africa. So access is also complicated. But there is interest, and I think it's partly linguistic, because of course a lot more is written, say, in Portuguese about the Portuguese colonies and liberation movements and so on, that the researchers in the West are not as aware of. It's a very kind of niche. We tend to read stuff that's written in English, speaking audience. So that's probably part of the answer.
That makes a lot of sense. What about, like, you're originally from Russia? Like, you moved to England you moved to the UK as a teenager. So I guess that sort of answers my question, but I was going to ask about what about in Russian academia? So you, as we'll talk about further in this interview, and also you mentioned in your book, and also, because a lot of, the nationalist movements in Africa or in Portuguese colonies specifically were inspired, had Marxist inspiration and connections with the Soviet, a little bit of the leadership. You talk more about elites and so on. So, but what is in the Russian archives that's also relevant, like in Russian language academia? Is there a lot of Russian research or former Soviet research into these wars that we're going to talk about?
Yeah, well, of course, you have to distinguish between the Soviet period and post 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Very different, yeah.
There's some continuities, but there's very different eras, because in the USSR, research into such topics was highly restricted, and as in the West, archives were not available because just there was no much time that had that was all happening in the 60s and 70s. So obviously researchers in the 70s or historians or kind of would not have access to materials at the time. But what has happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually, in the 90s, a lot of archival material became spontaneously and somewhat haphazardly available to both Russian and Western scholars, scholars of all the world.
Yeah.
Then a lot of this material was reclassified. But what has happened in the past 5 years or so, almost counterintuitively, is that a lot of this material, specifically from the Central Committee and the International Department that dealt with foreign liberation movements, to both foreign and domestic researchers. So that's why it's lucky to have been able to use a lot of this new archival material that has become available only in the past 5 years or so. So, wow. Of course, a lot of this material is classified, but a lot has become available up until the mid-70s. That's why we can tell now the story of Soviet foreign relations actually much better, obviously until recent events when travel and other things have become near impossible. But for the war in Ukraine, that's actually has been when you could still access the documents. You could see a lot more than, say, you could see in the 2000s.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of a weird zone. Like I understand the KGB archives are not open still.
Yes, right. Of course. The KGB or the GRU archives are not open still. But because of the way this worked, the main organ within the Central Committee, the main body, was the International Department, which dealt, was a political organ which relations with the liberation movements. So, for example, ANC or MPLA or Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front. So they would the documents of that organ, which was within the Central Committee, the documents of that organ became available. Yes, partly available. So, and of course, you would have, because it was kind of an organ where all of the diplomats would be sending the materials to, but also the KGB or the GRU would be writing reports, kind of overview reports of what's happening on the ground. They would also send those materials to the International Department. And quite a few of these have become available via this organ, via the documents, the files of the International Department.
So these, these KGB and GRU operatives have kind of given historians a loophole. Like, okay, our archives are closed, but the CCCPSU archives are open.
Yeah, because they had to, because they basically worked for the International Department in a sense. They were doing the kind of the work, right, the intelligence work, so that then they could send it to further higher up the chain, obviously to the head of the KGB, but also there would be copies to an International Department who also needed access to that information and who didn't have
True.
access to that information. And these are the files that you can read, luckily. But of course, it doesn't contain any very, very little, almost to no details about actual sources, clandestine sources, or about their operations on the ground. So that's all still classified in the archives of the KGB and the GRU.
So you can have the good general picture, but to actually have to, you don't have enough access to actually write a bio of an agent. You have enough to tell this is what this agent has done, but you can't really say, you couldn't write a bio about him.
Yeah, no, I don't think you could write about specific people, no, but you could kind of trace very fundamentally the general views of, say, KGB about a certain topic. So because they had two functions. One was information gathering from all sorts of sources. Another was doing kind of special measures, operations, right? Recruiting sources on the ground. So the first part, you can get to kind of the general overviews, right? So kind of your analytical reports, or like what's happening, right? But you can get to the other stuff, which is not available. I'm just saying, in Russia, obviously, you can get to that stuff in Czechoslovak archives and Czech archives.
Yes.
So, but that's the story.
Yeah, that's another way to open. And you mentioned old Czechoslovakia a lot, so that we'll go a bit more into that too. So how did you conduct your research? Like, I guess whatever archives you had, and I believe you mentioned in your book you traveled to Angola, you traveled to Mozambique.
Actually, I did the way it progressed, because I did research over a number of quite many years. So first I looked a lot at the archives, first of all in Russia, but then in Eastern Europe as well. I went to GDR, Poland, to Bulgaria, and to the Czech Republic, because a lot of the Russian materials were initially unavailable. They were initially available. That's why I had to finish my PhD initially. So I went to a lot of Eastern European archives, and access there, especially in Czech Republic, is incredibly good. Including to the intelligence files of the Czech intelligence service. So this is what I did initially. And then once the Russian archive started opening up, I did a lot more work there in the central archives and the records of the international department. But then, of course, as you do, as some of these projects start to spiral, especially the very long ones, the other side, right? I wanted to talk to the people, some of the protagonists of the story on the African side. So I went to Mozambique, to Maputo. I went to Cape Verde, and I did quite a bit of work, and I stayed for a little bit in Bissau. I did not go to Angola.
Oh, you didn't go to Angola. Oh, okay.
I didn't go to Angola. Yes. So for practical and political reasons, much more difficult to do. So that's why there's a little bit of a disbalance perhaps in my book. There's a lot more detail on maybe of texture to what I'm writing about Guinea-Bissau, and maybe less so about Angola, which I tried to rectify. But this is the oral history part is a little bit more skewed towards Guinea-Bissau story.
Oh, okay, I understand. Okay, well, that's very good. So kind of going into the kind of content of the book and so on. So just kind of, if you don't mind, giving like an early history of the Portuguese colonies in Africa. So you mentioned Cape Verde. There's also Sao Tome and Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. So these were colonized by Portugal in the 16th century. So in the context of, the age of discovery and the competition with Spain. What about other connections or colonial projects in these countries before that time, before the 16th century? Like, I know that Mozambique is very much connected to the Indian Ocean trade routes. Are you able to give like a little bit of explain a little bit of background of the history before colonization of these areas, like very briefly?
Yes, to summarize almost 5 centuries in a couple of
Yeah,
sentences,
that's the thing. Yeah.
I can totally do that. Well, I think when we're talking about formal colonialism, we're talking about kind of territorial conquest and control. I mean, the way that European colonialism, at least initially, or very early on development, Portuguese one, was a little bit more complicated
Mm,
because, of course, initially the Portuguese crown, but also the traders and all the people, the settlers who kind of were interested in that project were just interested in profit rather than
right.
controlling the whole interior of Africa. So
Hmm.
when first Portuguese started kind of exploring, right, that continent, they around 14th, 15th centuries, they set up their kind of little posts, trading routes all across the coast, all across the
Mm,
African coast, right?
right.
So, and not just in these three colonies, they had kind of a network um, of little ports
Hmm.
that connect their shipping routes that allowed them ultimately to to engage in slaving.
Yep.
That connected kind of Africa to the Americas, but also to kind of to Europe. So those are kind of a network that Portuguese were just one of the players, an important early player in
Right.
that slave trade.
Hmm.
For example, like Angola, of course, they hoped that they would find a lot of silver. They didn't, so they just started engaging massive slaving
Right.
that completely depopulated that part of Africa.
Oof.
But of course,
Yeah.
towards the end of the 19th century, when you have increasingly intense competition between the European colonial powers for areas of control and for sources of income, you've got a kind of a drive towards trying to assert formal territorial control over
Hmm.
specific areas. And in that competition, which kind of ultimately peaks in the Congress of Berlin, the Portuguese, with the help of the British, who are their allies, they get kind of they have greater control over these three zones, right, that later become Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, and they try to assert some form of control, territorial control of these areas. And this is how they get these three colonies, which are, of course, very disjointed,
Yeah.
right?
Very far apart
Um,
from each other.
very far apart, Mozambique obviously is East Africa. It has connected much more to South Africa than
Hmm.
to the other Portuguese colonies.
Right.
Angola, is of course in West Central Africa,
Hmm.
and Guinea-Bissau yet again, is closest to Guinea, French Guinea, and has kind of connections there. So these are kind of three disjointed territories, but
Hmm.
they try to make the best of it, which basically means extracting resources for the domestic, and up until later, successive Portuguese governments, and they tried to make those colonies profitable
Hmm.
for them, for Portugal, and they try to do it by extracting natural kind of resources, setting up plantations, cotton growing, coffee growing. Of course, now
Hmm.
Angola is really big for coffee.
Hmm.
Mozambique, it's a huge push to make it a colony that grows a lot of cotton, and they do it by basically uh, engaging in forced labor practices. So using the labor of Africans, and a lot
Hmm.
of it is forced labor, to grow cheap cotton, say, for the
Yeah.
Portuguese textile industry. That's the basic kind of shape of Portuguese colonies, which is both similar to other cases, but also slightly distinct because, of course, Portugal is one of the poorest European countries, so there's very, very to no investment in infrastructure,
Right.
or schools at all in the colonies.
Very interesting point you just make about Portugal being one of the poorest European countries. Because, I spent almost a year in Mozambique. I lived with my wife's family there. And so it's kind of like, I noticed that the infrastructure was kind of poor and everything like that. And I'd heard stories about the same in Angola. So I kind of had this question in my mind. It would be very interesting to visit other former Portuguese colonies like Angola and maybe Sao Tome and maybe even Brazil to some extent. Maybe not Macau, but I think that would be a different story because it's so small. But it would be interesting to see like kind of the infrastructure in like if they're similar. And because I know in South Africa the roads are much better. I know I've never been to Zimbabwe, but I do know that the roads are generally much better and stuff like that. So I was wondering if that was like one of the big differences between a Portuguese colony and an English one.
Yeah, I mean, initially, of course, now it's been some time since this is the colonialism ended. But yes, initially, the Portuguese, they invested very, very little in the colonies, and that concerned all aspects of life and infrastructure. And only, in fact, an important aspect of Portuguese colonialism is that a very, very small minority in the colonies actually had Portuguese citizenship. Without Portuguese citizenship, you had extremely limited access to schools and you had to pay special taxes. And in fact, this is when if you were not a Portuguese citizen, you could be, employed you could be in a forced labor situation. You could be basically pulled up to build the roads for no money. So this was kind of the structure, the racialized structure, and that it was a racialized order because those people who were of multiracial descent had, majority of them did have Portuguese citizenship. And those who weren't, they had to become assimilado, and it was extremely difficult to become an or assimilated person in the context of Portuguese colony, because you had to kind of pay a big sum of money. You had to prove that you were basically Portuguese by way of your culture. You had to speak the language, and you had to live in a certain way. So only a small minority of people across the Portuguese colonies had citizenship rights and were exempt from things like forced labor and so on. So I'm talking about this up until the 1960s.
Right. Okay. And then kind of like in the book, you mentioned 1959, 1960s as kind of the, I guess, inflection point when everything is kind of like, okay, there's kind of a buildup of resistance against the Portuguese colonial power. People start having ideas about Marxism and liberation and stuff like that. And then eventually it becomes, I guess, the Angolan uprising is the first, the kind of like the point you mentioned where it's like, this is where the wars actually start in Portuguese Africa. What about, like, what are some of the parties and the people involved in each, like in Guinea-Bissau, I guess Amilcar Cabral with the PAIGC, Angola and PLA, and then Mozambique with Edward Mandlane with Frelimo, after there were a number of parties, and then Frelimo kind of becomes the dominant power or dominant nationalist party there. What are your impressions and like of these or summaries of these parties and people, and what were the Soviet impressions of them?
Yes, as you mentioned, in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, starting from, since the 19th century, there was, of course, resistance to Portuguese colonialism more generally, and there were quite a lot of, revolts and uprisings overall. But if we are talking about kind of modern nationalist movement, right, or kind of more contemporary one, and there are lots of groups that in all three contexts start to emerge both in the colonies, especially in urban settings, in the capitals like Luanda or Maputo, and also in the neighboring countries, because there's a lot of immigration from the Portuguese colonies to the neighboring countries, say from Mozambique to South Africa or South Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe.
Right.
So these Mozambican or Angolan migrants, they oftentimes set up kind of self-help organizations in neighboring countries that oftentimes grew into kind of a more of a movements that aspire to independence, to campaign for independence.
Okay.
First, they thought many of the film that could be a negotiated settlement with the Portuguese, like they happened, say, in Tanganyika, right?
Right.
Or in Guinea. But very quickly, by the early 60s, many of them realized that negotiated settlement, a peaceful settlement for independence, would not be possible in the Portuguese case, because the Portuguese dictator, Antonio Salazar, was not willing to let the Portugals go, right? Unlike the British or the French eventually. So that's the difference here, because eventually a lot of these kind of local groups, they hope for negotiated settlement, and there are many different groups, right? So there's not just these three. So there's a lot of conflict and between these groups, and kind of there are a lot of different ideas about independence and relationship with the Portuguese, how this is going to work out. Eventually by the mid-60s, there are three kind of parties that emerged in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau that would become dominant, especially in Mozambique and Bissau. As I mentioned, in Guinea-Bissau, that is the PAIGC, Party for Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. In Mozambique, that's Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front. And in Angola, this is the country where the situation is much more complicated, because there are three nationalist movements that all three of them have quite substantial local African, but also international support.
Right.
They have the MPLA, which is a kind of a movement based around Luanda, the capital, but you also have the FNLA, a group which is based in the neighboring Congo Kinshasa, which has substantial support from the government of Congo Kinshasa, but also from the United States. Right. And this is where the Angolan case becomes quite different to, say, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, because in Angola, the nationalist movement not only is split, but all the rival nationalist groups, they receive both local African, but also international support.
Right. Yeah, that's a very different case. And you mentioned that the first in Angola, kind of the spark that lights everything is when one of the, I guess it was called the Leopoldville School, if you want to put it that way. It was like a anti-colonial, but more pro-capitalist, pro-Western faction invaded northern Angola, and then the MPLA was actually caught maybe a little bit off guard, actually. Yeah, that's the impression I got from when I read that in your book, or at least the MPLA wasn't the first to react.
Yes, I mean, this is a very long story of competition between various forms of nationalism and various visions of what Angola should become after independence. And this competition you mentioned between this kind of Luanda-based group that's obviously based in exile during the time of Portuguese anti-colonial wars, and another group which is based in Leopoldville or Kinshasa, led by Holden Roberto, is a movement that aspires towards a kind of an American type of modernity, they're more interested in capitalism. The MPLA and Agostinho Neto, the leader of MPLA, is more interested in socialism in a way, and they have close connections with the Soviet Union and help from the Soviet Union. And the FNLA has support from the Congolese Kinshasa government that are also aligned, with Joseph Mobutu aligned to the United States.
Right.
So, and all of that competition is ongoing, in the 1960s and the 70s. So when Portugal, in 1974, when there's a revolution in Portugal, there's a vacuum of power suddenly in Angola, and competition between these local groups, local Angolan nationalist movements, becomes much more intense. It was always going on, right? But it becomes much more intense, and where it becomes a kind of a Cold War story as well, because each group seeks international support.
Right.
So that they can dominate political power, and after Angola becomes independent.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. And I believe in the end, MPLA won out, right?
And in the end, MPLA wins out. Initially, after Angola becomes de jure independent, but then the civil war continues into the 1980s and actually into the 1990s. The complicated story.
Yeah, similar to Mozambique too. Independence in 1975, and then Frelimo versus Renamo. But I guess Renamo doesn't really come into play in like the context of your book, but that's a little bit different. I guess a lot of what we talked about already is preamble for kind of what we're talking about coming up to. Kind of going into the background of Soviet support of anti-colonial nationalist movements in Portuguese Africa. The Soviet Union's, had a communist internationalism, obviously, that kind of fluctuated between internationalism and, the Great Seal, or the coat of arms, I guess you could say, of the Soviet Union says in Russian, proletariat of all countries unite. And it says that in other languages too, of the Soviet languages found throughout the Soviet Union. But then eventually Stalin focused on socialism in one country. This is after the failed invasion of Poland, after the Civil War. And then, eventually, as you mentioned in your book too, Stalin was focused on defeating Nazi Germany and so on. So he focused more on socialism in one country, and he was anti-Trotskyite, who was more, Trotsky advocated more for world communist revolution. He was much more, optimistic for communism's chances and much more radical, I suppose. So how did this whole situation, like Soviet internationalism, affect Africa maybe before World War II? Did it have much of an effect before World War II? Or and then how did Khrushchev and his denunciation of Stalinism kind of change things and make the Soviet Union more involved in Africa? Maybe that's two questions at once, but
yeah, it is. Well, the interwar story is fascinating and actually quite complex,
right?
Because once the Soviets set up the Third Communist International in 1919, they of course want to promote international revolution, but of course their attitudes towards how this should be done and their priorities, also foreign policy, change. So in the 1920s and the 1930s, and you kind of allude to some of that. After 1928 and up to around 1932, this is actually the peak of Soviet and kind of Comintern support for Black liberation, because and this is of course coincides with this industrialization and collectivization drive in the USSR, and there's a sense that revolution is coming, and the capitalist countries they are kind of competing, and revolution is kind of getting closer. And what we need to do to aid this process is to speed up and help anti-colonial movements.
Right.
So that we can break up European colonialism. But of course, in the mid-30s, once the threat of Nazi Germany is pretty obvious, these priorities shift. And, from Stalin's point of view, it's much more important to have a good working relationship with Britain and France rather than supporting kind of anti-colonial movements. But
Right.
there's the shift there. So it's this is a complex story of the interwar period.
Right.
During the peak, from 28 to 32, the Comintern makes an attempt, and the African Americans are really, really closely involved in that, but also some activists from the Caribbean, to spread the message to the colonies, but they also call on European communist parties to spread the revolutionary message in the colonies, including in Africa.
Right.
They try to do so, and you have quite a few kind of Africans coming to USSR. Many of them are interested in Marxism, but some of them are not. Some of them study in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. So they kind of try to set up connection between anti-colonial and Black activists across the world, across the Black Atlantic in the 1930s. But of course, as already mentioned, towards the late 30s, Soviet priorities are very different. And eventually the Comintern is disbanded in 1943. So
right.
There is a very rich history of Soviet support for anti-colonial movements and for anti-racist campaigns during the interwar period. And of course, the South African Communist Party is set up in the 1920s, and it becomes part of the Communist International.
Wow.
Right? For example. So again, there is a rich history around that relationship.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, and you're right, the war puts a hold on a lot of these things. And straight after the war, Stalin is not interested in the so-called Third World. And it's only when Nikita Khrushchev succeeds Stalin, who dies in 1953, that the Soviet Union sort of rediscovers the Third World, as it was known at the time, newly emerging countries in Africa, and tries to establish relations with leaders in the Third World, including with African leaders and liberation movements.
Yeah. So how was communism kind of promoted in Africa? Like, was it the same as the rest of the Third World? I know I've done some study in, the Soviet Union and in the Middle East. And what they often did was make connections with local nationalist parties, not even necessarily communist ones, but like kind of anti-colonial nationalist parties like the Baathists in Iraq and in Syria. And they also had a lot of like expositions, like it was a lot of cultural connection and like radio, like scholarships to study in the Soviet Union and, reaching out to the Arab world through education, for example. And you mentioned in your book about the Writers' Conference in Tashkent in October 1958. And this kind of created initial communist or Soviet contact with African nationalists. What was the purpose and the effect of this conference? And was it mostly just cultural, or was it also like technical support, like help for engineering projects, like it was for the Aswan Dam in Egypt and so on? Or was it more like cultural and making these initial first connections?
I would say yes to both of your proposals. Yes, a lot of this starts with cultural exchange initially. The Soviet Union, but also other socialist countries in Eastern Europe, but also China. They start putting, in the 50s, they start putting these events like the Writers' Conference, the famously 1957 Congress of World Youth in Moscow. And they try to forge connections with elites in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, inviting them to the Soviet Union, and forging these links through cultural exchange, assigning cultural exchange agreements so that, say, a music group would come to USSR, and then somebody from the USSR would go to a particular country. So there's all this very rich kind of cultural exchange that starts happening. They start sending movies, starts trying to sell Soviet films in the Third World, organize a film festival in Tashkent, organize writers' conferences. That's on one hand. On the other hand, if we're talking about independent African states, a huge thing that tried to do in the 1950s is to support economic development in these countries, and actually start to promote what Alessandro Andola has recently called Soviet kind of model of development.
Okay.
Initially in West Africa, Guinea, Ghana, and Mali becomes in the late 50s kind of a beacon of what Soviet-style modernization could achieve in these countries. So it's initially both cultural and very, very substantially economic help and aid to African countries. So they basically try to, because the ideas and Khrushchev kind of calls on the West that socialism and capitalism can compete peacefully, and the third world would be an arena for that peaceful competition. So we will show you that social development, and with the help of the Soviet Union, you can actually achieve rapid economic growth. But this is possible because the first generation of African leaders, of course, are very suspicious of capitalism, because to them, capitalism meant exploitation.
And slavery and so on.
Yes, so a lot of them were interested in kind of alternative ideas and socialist ideas. Many of them try to make their own vision, actually, which is, not non-Soviet, non-American, kind of a lot of this around African socialism. So try to combine some of these ideas with local traditions. So that's why there's a lot of interest in some of these ideas around communalism, sort of the state, the role of the state should be a vehicle for modernization.
You kind of mentioned that, Khrushchev and Khrushchev and the denunciation of Stalinism and so on kind of wakes the Soviet Union up to the third world again. Like, we're aware of it now again. But at the same time, you do kind of mention that Africa was still a little bit low on the Soviet priority, because I guess maybe Europe was much more important, with Berlin, East Germany, and competition with NATO and so on. But if Africa was a bit lower in priority, why did many bureaucrats still support in African independence groups? It was still kind of like a way of promoting, again, this peaceful competition.
Yeah, I think there's a twofold. It's true. When we're talking about Africa, we have to realize that, it wasn't, the most important priority for the Soviet leadership, right? For the likes of Brezhnev or so on, especially in the late 60s or 70s, they were much more concerned about competition, about United States, about Western Europe, about China. So Africa is not a priority. Yet it is important. It is there, and they kind of, but it's not a priority. So that's why, and that's one of my arguments in the book, is that kind of a middle ranking bureaucrats kind of take over most of the day-to-day kind of thinking around policy, also conducting and kind of forging relations with African revolutionaries. A lot of this stems from this kind of late 50s cultural exchange, when many of them first meet kind of African revolutionaries, say Cabral or Neto, for the first time in the USSR during these events, and they forge kind of personal relationships with them. And many of them are genuinely, I would argue, genuinely feel a certain camaraderie, a certain kind of solidarity for the cause of African liberation. Bear in mind, many of them had gone through the Second World War. Many of them had kind of military backgrounds, experience. So they do kind of feel this camaraderie on a personal level, but also they do believe, many of them, that socialism is generally a better system than capitalism.
Yeah.
So, and this is where, and again, the kind of people I'm talking are bureaucrats, but also members of the international journalists, members of intelligence services, they kind of forge these personal relations that are also shaped, kind of the opinions of Africans are shaped by personal considerations, but also by their outlook, their worldview, for, if not, you don't want to call it ideology, but let's call it worldview. So
Right. Okay.
that's how they see them, and many of them kind of start lobbying on their behalf, up the chain, because there's a hierarchical way of making decisions in the Soviet system, but you have some lobbying power, right? If you can, kind of push for certain decisions. So that's why, that's how it emerges. And this is one of my arguments, that the military become increasingly invested in the liberation movements because, of course, they're involved in supplying them weapons and training a lot of these men, because there is active guerrilla war going on, starting, say, 61, 63 in Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Angola.
Right.
So that's how they get kind of pulled in.
Well, you mentioned the failure of the Soviet Union's support of Patrice Lumumba in Zaire, the former Belgian colony. Because Mobutu, Patrice Lumumba was killed, and then Mobutu took over, more of a pro-Western figure. And then the USSR then shifted to clandestine means that you're just mentioning, with KGB and bureaucrats and so on. And you call it Cold War on the cheap. So does that mean, do you mean by that, it's a lot cheaper to send a bureaucrat and somebody to maybe teach someone and lobby and stuff like that, rather than send a bunch of anti-air missiles like they did to Syria? Is that kind of why you call it Cold War on the cheap?
A little bit. I mean, of course, it's a moniker, but what I'm trying to say is that in the Congo, the Soviets very quickly realized that they don't have the means to project real military power all the way across to sub-Saharan Africa in a very effective way, especially in the 1960s. It's very hard for them, to send suddenly ships, right? Or to even flying planes. Right now, we live in a world where, air travel is so quick, but even the way that kind of planes flew was different in the 1960s than it's
of course, yeah.
So it's much harder than there's a lot of talk and rhetoric, but they have very little actual means on the ground to support their local allies. And also, they don't really want to make, to start a nuclear war because of the Congo, right?
Right, exactly.
Or because of Patrice Lumumba. This is also not something they want to do or interested in.
Yeah.
So what they try to do, I think, using kind of secret intelligence to affect change by clandestine means is much cheaper, because of course there's then deniability, right? You don't need to send a lot of material aid if what you can do or try to do, right, is to infiltrate local nationalist movement, or try to kind of forge close or clandestine relationships with some of the Africans, right? So it's kind of much cheaper, and also from the perspective of the global Cold War, is also a safer option. That's why they try to kind of use one of the ways to kind of, but it's not the only one. But of course, their power capabilities improved by the mid-70s, and that's why somewhere like Angola, they can actually they can project their power more effectively by the mid-70s than, say, by the 1960s.
That's one question I wrote as I was reading, where it's so kind of the effects of the support. Maybe it's a little harder, like you were saying, the KGB and GRU intelligence archives are closed, so it's a little hard to say maybe like how many pieces of equipment they sent. I remember doing research on Soviet military aid to Syria, and there was even like numbers of how many different types of airplanes they sent and stuff like that. Is there that kind of information with what they sent to Mozambique and Angola? Like, how many shipments of weapons they sent? Is there any data like that?
It's piecemeal. Yeah. Yes, you can find some traces in the archive about quantities and in terms of quantities of weapons, but also in terms of how much they spent on all of that. But it's not even. But what I can say is that military support was indeed very substantial to both kind of their chosen nationalist movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. It was about quantities. So yes, of course, others were also sending weapons. The Cubans or Czechoslovaks and Bulgarians and so on.
Right.
The Soviets did more, right? They sent more, but it was quantities. But also, don't forget quality of weapons or the type of weapon. Important. Because if you think about what a guerrilla war is, it's, say that was waged in Mozambique or Guinea-Bissau, it's you are up against, as a kind of local African revolutionary nationalist movement, you're up against a fairly well-equipped and well-trained army, the Portuguese army, that are also supplied with very good weapons from NATO, right? Including craft. So if you have control over an airspace like the Portuguese were, right? It's very difficult to win the war.
Right? Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It is if you're being bombed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hard to control, especially urban areas where there's a kind of significant military presence. And this was a fairly effective Portuguese army, right? That was experienced also because they were in this war for a long time. Of course, the motivation started to change very dramatically by the mid-70s, as it happens with these prolonged wars. But still, it was a fairly well-trained, well-equipped army. So what the Soviets do, and they do this similar in Vietnam, is that they provide increasingly more sophisticated weapons that eventually, in the case of Guinea-Bissau, can shift this advantage that the Portuguese have over the airspace by providing basically anti-aerial missiles, for especially the Strela complex. That
like their equivalent of the Stinger missile, basically.
That it's very easy to hold. It's quite mobile, so you can use it, move it. So in the context of guerrilla war, it was important. So they start by 1974 when they received these weapons in Guinea-Bissau. They start shooting down Portuguese aircraft, quite substantial numbers. And in Mozambique, they also received but a little bit later. So and that's what in Guinea-Bissau starts to shift kind of the balance, starts to once the Portuguese no longer controlling the skies, they have a real problem. It doesn't happen in Mozambique, because in Mozambique they received this a little bit later, and in Angola, the nationalist movements, for a variety of reasons, are not in a good shape by 75, because of also a lot of internal problems, internal splits. But that military aid is substantial, and both in terms of quantity, in terms of quality. But of course, you mentioned scholarships. It's not just about military aid. The Soviets also provide scholarships, and a lot of people go study in the USSR. Also after independence than before. But it's not just military, but military is probably the most significant when we're talking about the course of anti-colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Yeah, well, one final point I mentioned about like military aid. At least, okay, so as the 70s move on, that makes sense because, I was about to ask about how your assessment of how effective this war on the cheap, Cold War on the cheap was. But eventually it was. Eventually it was effective as Portugal kind of loses momentum in the fighting, and then Strelas starts coming in and stuff like that. And then also, and then Portugal has its own Carnation Revolution, and Portugal becomes a democracy. But also, it's a different context too. Like you mentioned, it's hard to get advanced weapons to a militia group like Frelimo or something, but it's a lot easier to send SAM missiles and MiG-21s to Syria or North Korea, which are both, or North Vietnam, which are communist states already. So it's a lot easier to send something that's actually a state. You're not sending something to a militia group, which doesn't, so it's a different context. So military aid there might be some, but you're not going to ship a MiG-21 into the jungle.
Yeah, no, you're right. Of course, logistical problems with transferring these weapons were really, really important and were very substantial. And because again, we're talking about very different contexts. In Guinea-Bissau, which is a small country bordering on Guinea, there is a little bit more ease of access because you could they were just shipping these weapons to the port of Conakry in Guinea.
Okay.
And from there you could transport it by land to the neighboring Guinea-Bissau with relative ease, right?
Right. Okay.
Relative ease. I mean, of course, the infrastructure wasn't ideal, but we were talking about something that was very doable. When we're talking about say the case of Angola, and in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the war was happening in eastern Angola, which bordered on Zambia and Tanzania. You're talking about both really, really long and enormous spaces over which this weaponry had to be transported via Dar es Salaam, via Lusaka. Again, a lot of it was on foot.
Right.
And so local authorities had oftentimes complicated relationships with the liberation movements, and were not always too thrilled when you have an armed group in your country,
right,
receiving weapons from a foreign power. So also the host countries, African host countries that hosted these liberation movements, oftentimes also, had a problematic relationship with them and allowed them to kind of engage in this guerrilla war because they were committed to African liberation in general, right? So somebody like Julius Nyerere in Tanganyika, most importantly, or Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia. At the same time, of course, they wanted to control these movements to a certain extent because, again, if you have a local armed group, who are kind of armed to their teeth and potentially can intervene or have some kind of role in your internal politics, right? And so this was a complicated dynamics also internally. But in the end, a lot of these weapons, sophisticated weapons, did reach kind of their targets because I guess the aim from the liberation movements was not necessarily to kind of overwhelm the Portuguese military, right?
Right. But that's not guerrilla warfare.
Or it would be very hard, but to make it as difficult as possible for the Portuguese to say, as they did say, that this is just a bunch of terrorists, right? Communist terrorists.
Right.
And there is no problem for us. And they wanted to make it costly for them. They wanted to make it difficult so that internally within the military, the mood would change, would shift, and That's what they're trying to say. They're trying um, to affect change within the Portuguese society and military, and that the cost of war would become very high.
Yeah, very much like in Vietnam.
Yeah, yes. So and eventually in Guinea-Bissau they did make it happen, because of course if you're an officer and see this war continuing for years and years and years, and you throw your people and material at that war and nothing is happening, but actually you have your aircraft starting being shot down, increasing numbers, you start raising questions about how winnable is this war in the end.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it just becomes you can win every battle, but you can lose the war just from the exhaustion, just like the US in Vietnam. Yeah. I really want to ask about this because this is like your main point of the book, kind of talking again about this, the bureaucrats and everything like that. But you specifically look at the Czechoslovakia and the Czech Slovak intelligence. You especially look at a person, I'm sorry, I forget his name. I forget the operative's name. And so you mentioned that the Czech intelligence and the USSR intelligence get together and kind of plan to support starting with the MPLA in Angola. How did this happen, and kind of like how did this and what was the effect of this plan? Like, what were the details? What were they actually doing in this plan?
Yes, well, the story of the full story of cooperation between different intelligence services in Eastern Europe and the USSR, it still has to be written. We do not know all the details of how it worked, but we do know that, of course, there was a lot of conversation and exchange, and in fact, the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia intelligence services that started kind of having these coordination meetings, right, where they would basically get together and try to make a joint plan of kind of operations in the third world. So, right. And similar things happened with others, but we do not know the full story yet. So but we do know that in Africa, for example, the KGB and the Czechoslovak intelligence, the STB, they did try to coordinate the activities, and they tried to engage in joint operation. They would share information. And the Czechoslovaks overall were really actively involved in supporting liberation movements in the third world more generally, starting from the late 50s. Of course, they had a very advanced and developed arms industry in Czechoslovakia. So they became kind of a go-to capital for many, say, kind of African leaders to go and kind of forge these kind of arms sales deals. And they became important initially in Angola and Guinea-Bissau as supporting, kind of basically sending cash, sending weapons, and training some of these kind of African revolutionaries. So we know all of this because, unlike in the Soviet case, in the Russian case, the full archive of the Czechoslovak intelligence is open to us. Right. We can get to the details, not just these overviews, analytical overviews, but we can actually get to the specific operational details, and including up to the looking into the backgrounds of the operatives and what they did. So yes, the story of the Czechoslovak operative you referred to, his name was code name was Alter. He basically
Alter, yeah.
He came to Guinea Conakry in 1960, and it was his first assignment abroad. I think one of the first kind of important assignments abroad. and he basically set up shop there in Conakry.
Okay.
And trying to forge relations with different African nationalist revolutionaries. He quite liked Cabral, and he kind of sponsored his trip to Prague. And then he kind of he offered that we should recruit this promising young man. And this is kind of where I explain how these kind of personal relationships mattered, and this is how the Czechoslovakia became an important early supporter of the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. Part of it was through these clandestine connections.
Yeah, because you focus a lot on the personal connections. Is that because again, it's Cold War on the cheap, and it's not really like we talked about the logistical problems of sending massive military aid to a PAIGC, for example. What kind of personal connections do they have? Like, I found it interesting. You talk about, Alter recruiting Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau. It's almost it almost seemed like they recruited him as an agent to work for them. That's what it seemed like.
Yeah, no, this would not be the exactly correct reading of the story. So no, they did not recruit him as agent. He was never an agent.
Okay.
But they called him, but indeed they proposed to recruit him, and they kind of said that they did recruit him as so-called clandestine or confidential contact, which was because of different classifications, but they're important, which was different to a paid agent. But they often use this kind of ambiguous classifications, which, and again, this is where we come to the archive, because think about it, if you're, not that you are, but if you're a young intelligence officer in Conakry, it's your first assignment, you also want to be promoted, and you want
to true, yeah,
show to your superiors that you've done this great deed, right?
Right.
You obviously big yourself up, and you big yourself up. It's like, yeah, I recruited Amilcar Cabral.
Got this guy on our side, yeah.
Yeah, so he is our clandestine contract, and his code name is Secretary, right? That's what position. But in reality, even if you look at the archive, what you see is that actually Cabral, they were trying to get him to do things, right? But he didn't do the things so that asked him to do. Not like in a Cold War movie where we have somebody kind of copying documents in like a little dim lit office, right? Cabral, yeah, he probably knew what was going on, but he obviously needed support for his movement. He needed the arms, he needed the cash, he needed the training. So he kind of agreed to share information, but with them and about what's happening in Africa, developments. But he was very reluctant to go anywhere beyond that. And say there was a case where they tried him to get somebody from his group to go to Czechoslovakia and spy on African students studying Czechoslovakia. He would not outright refuse, but he would never find such a person would never emerge, right? He was like, no, I can't find anybody. I'm sorry, like I can't. So nobody is available for this.
Right. Okay. Oh, interesting.
So he, managed to kind of shape this relationship in his own advantage. He had a tremendous amount of agency in this, and the more famous he became, the less he was willing to engage with any of these guys. So, but especially that the Soviets became much more important donor to the PAIGC and the Czechoslovaks, and he kind of, but because he was a very good diplomat, was just, but he managed to kind of manage the relation well. But obviously, if you're looking just at the archive, there's all this talk about how he was like the big clandestine contact. But if you actually look into the details, actually what he did or didn't do, you see that he had a lot more agency in this, and he wasn't he wasn't a spy for Czechoslovak intelligence.
Yeah, you're right.
So,
No, I understand.
And that's how a lot of times we kind of misinterpret this, that in the archive, we recruited all these people, but in reality, this is not how it worked. Some of the Africans, they didn't even know they were recruited, or some of them actually. There's a great case of Denis Pambea, who actually worked for KG for Czechoslovaks, but also for the MI6 and for the CIA, like at the same time. So
wow,
this is a lot more complicated and interesting here.
Right, exactly, definitely.
Yes, but I think that were important, because to understand the story of early stage Czechoslovak relationship with the PAIGC, you have to know that kind of clandestine relationship, and you have to know about somebody like Alter, right? And his role. Why? Because the question is, why were Czechoslovaks supplying arms and cash to this tiny kind of liberation movement, which was relatively unknown in the early 60s, and so was Cabral, relatively unknown. So you need to know, that's why it's important to know about these connections, which were oftentimes kind of clandestine.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you have to go a little bit deeper, like not necessarily reflecting the views of the Soviet leadership of the time, which, like, support of Vietnam or North Korea would be a bit more visible. But again, like we said before, a completely different context. But then these guys like Alter and whoever else in the KGB might be involved, or GRU might be involved, would also have, a role in saying, hey, we need to get these guys. And the leadership then says, oh, it's a good idea. Then, like you say, we talked about a few minutes ago, eventually they start sending anti-air missiles to Angola, instead of just having personal contact and like a buddy over in Africa. Basically, it becomes much more than that. But it starts with that clandestine connection. Yeah,
not always clandestine, could be also just some person, like, just because, for example, in Moscow, people like members of the Soviet Solidarity Committee would be very involved, but some of it was clandestine, some of this was very open and public. Because going back what we talked about, the kind of cultural exchange, cultural relationships, kind of cultural political, they also did kind of make a difference, because these kind of so-called public organizations like the Soviet Solidarity Committee were also very much involved in kind of hosting African revolutionaries, or even like the head of the Institute of African Studies in Moscow, Ivan Patyokhin, right? Who he was also, for example, involved very early on before he died in 1964. So there were all of these kind of people that I talk in my book, and when you dig deep in the archive, you can see their role was important. And as I argue, these people, the way that they've related their interlocutors, their African clients, some of it was personal, but a lot of it was also shaped by their worldview, the ideology.
Right. You mentioned the worldview. Yeah.
Yes, it mattered to them that Cabral, was very interested in Marxism. He was a Marxist. He was very interested in socialism and scientific socialism. It mattered. It also mattered to them, say that Eduardo Mondlane, who was the first president of Frelimo, had a very close connection initially to the Kennedy administration, right? They obviously did not like that. And to them, he was an American, right? Because he spent, he was educated in the United States. He had an American wife.
Yeah.
All of that, they were very suspicious about the Soviets.
Yeah.
And I argue because of their worldview. To understand why they treated certain people different, I think you need to think about ideology as well.
Right. Yeah, well, it always comes up in the Cold War. Yeah. Actually, talking about ideology. When I was in Mozambique, I was really struck by how the streets are named. You have Amilcar Cabral, you have Karl Marx Street, Kim Jong-il Street, for goodness sake. Like the coat of arms of Mozambique has this huge red star on it. So how communist, so to speak, quote unquote, was Frelimo and these other parties? Like, I know the Soviet leadership kind of like, when talking about Syria and Iraq and like, in the Middle East, there were some communists were persecuted in the Middle East, but they still supported the Baathists because the Baathists were secular nationalist Arab parties, but they were convenient allies, even if they were persecuting fellow communists. How communist was Frelimo and PAIGC and MPLA? Were they mostly communist, or were they kind of more like, were there instances where somebody thought themselves as socialist and anti-colonialist, but not necessarily full-on communist?
Yeah, no, I definitely would not call these nationalist movements communist.
Right.
They were not communist parties. There were broad nationalist fronts.
Right. It's a bit different.
But of course, like elsewhere in the continent, many among the leadership, but also the rank and file in these movements, they were interested in socialist ideas. I think there were a lot of different people in the movement with very complex views. If we're talking about somebody like Mondlane, right? On one hand, he was a Christian, right? A kind of devoted Christian. Also, at the same time, he was interested in socialism, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about Machel, right?
Machel,
who succeeded. Machel was interested in China, in the ideas of Mao Zedong, was interested in socialism. But it's really hard to kind of, but they were also kind of wanted to do it in their own way, right? So they're also interested in, for example, Tanganyika and Tanzanian socialism and what Nyerere was doing with kind of his project of Ujamaa,
okay.
Agricultural kind of communalism. So yes, I wouldn't call them communist. I think it's a very complex discussion.
Yeah.
At the same time, of course, after independence in Angola and Mozambique, in Angola MPLA, in Mozambique Frelimo proclaimed themselves Marxist-Leninist parties.
Right.
But at the same time in Angola, say, the MPLA also oftentimes persecuted grassroots leftist groups. So it's a very complicated story which hasn't been fully written. I think what they were interested in also kind of the role of the party,
right,
the role of the movement in unifying what under colonial rule were fundamentally quite weak states, because somewhere like Mozambique or Angola, is a country that's almost artificially pulled together, right, in the 19th century, and you have a lot of people of different ethnicities living together in a country that has oftentimes closer connections to neighboring countries, right? So I think for them, Marxism and socialism was a way of creating a nation state beyond ethnicity, to use ideology as a unifying marker. So that's why they were interested in that ideology. Many of them they were also interested in kind of rapid economic growth and modernization that in the Soviet Union, for one way or another, was achieved, kind of in the 30s, but even in the 1950s, the Soviet Union was growing at very fast rate. But also there were people in the movements who were interested in social democracy, right? And then the experience of the Nordic countries, and the Nordic countries provided a lot of humanitarian aid in all three, and especially actually in Mozambique, and South. So there would not be a straightforward answer to your question.
Right. Yeah, that's a whole nother episode.
Yes, but there were different people in the movement. If you're talking about somebody like Marcelino dos Santos, who was an important member of Frelimo, he was very much inspired by the Chinese Revolution, for example, because of experience in China and traveling in China during the Great Leap Forward. And of course, a lot of these people were interested in scientific socialism, or kind of because what they saw as African socialism in the 60s, somebody that was Nkrumah, for example, advocated in Ghana, didn't really work out.
Right.
So didn't achieve the rapid economic growth that was promised. So they were also wanting to modernize kind of the people tradition, to go kind of to educate the people, to kind of raise their level, so that this kind of modernization would be possible.
Okay.
So these were fundamental. I would say that these were modernizing movements that were interested in modernity, in progress, but I would not necessarily call them communist. I don't think they were communist, but they were kind of complicated movements that had a lot of different ideological and kind of ideational strands within them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's what I always love to say. One of the things that I find interesting, studying the Cold War and so on, and even modern times, is that one mistake that many people make is communism is a monolith. It's always the same thing. It's always this, but it's like, no, communists, there are different types. There are different types of communism. There's like, there are different types of conservatives too. So it's like a very, so like that nuance is very important. I've mentioned it on my podcast too. It's not one thing. There are different types and there are degrees of it.
Yes, absolutely. I think these people were fundamentally, because of their backgrounds, right? Growing up during the interwar period, under kind of a colonial dictatorship, they, of course, their background is that they were highly suspicious of kind of capitalism, in this kind of form of exploitation. Of capitalism, and they often equal that to kind of colonialism. So for them, socialism would be something that would allow liberation, not just the jure liberation, but of course real kind of economic liberation of their countries. So this was fundamental to them. Once, of course, these countries became independent, there was no blueprint that anybody had. I mean, even in the Soviet Union, right? Of course, 1917, Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks didn't have a blueprint for what they were doing, and they changed their mind how they were going to achieve the aims of a worker state. But again, they were. Many of them were Marxist. They kind of shared a Marxist worldview, but they didn't necessarily have a specific blueprint for the society, especially including for how to achieve economic modernization.
Right.
So they were kind of also responding to the reality on the ground, which was a very complicated economic reality.
Yeah,
As
that's
the
true.
Portuguese withdrew.
But there's always going to be a different approach and a different worldview approach to different to the same problem.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so just very quickly, talking about other former British colonies in the area, like Mozambique specifically, is surrounded by these English and, well, I guess Tanzania is a former German one, but I guess the British took it over in World War One. It seems to me anyway, but that Zimbabwe is a little bit relevant because I understand that China supported one of the parties, ZANU, which is Robert Mugabe, Mugabe's party, while the Soviets supported ZAPU, which was another party active in the area. That's according to a YouTube video I watched from a channel called The Front, which is a military channel. But so did you find that, and the reason I mentioned that Zimbabwe is kind of relevant because it's close to Mozambique, and ZANU fighters went back and forth between Mozambique and, well, what was then called Rhodesia. And Rhodesian troops even raided ZANU-ZAPU militant camps in Mozambique across the border. So did you find that Zimbabwe was relevant in your studies over this, like in this book or like other research you've done in Portuguese Africa?
South Rhodesia comes Zimbabwe, right?
Right.
Is a little bit, is not as important in the story of in the 1960s and 70s, even though, of course, I mean, it's of course extremely relevant because Portugal, South Africa, and South Rhodesia had an important military alliance at the time called Alcora, kind of clandestine military alliance. So these three countries in the regions were closely aligned, and they were helping each other economically, militarily, and intelligence. So that's to start with. Of course, yeah, it is relevant in that sense. In the sense of the liberation movements before independence, for Frelimo, who of course had an alliance, who had an alliance with ZANU actually. For Frelimo, the context of, because they were based in Tanzania. Tanzania was much more important for the Angolan MPLA. It was North Rhodesia or Zambia, which Zambia and Tanzania, which was much more important for them as a launching pad for their guerrilla war, and also as their host country, because of course South Rhodesia was still under white minority rule, and there was no way that the white minority kind of regime would be hosting them, right? Of course.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's why, but of course, later on, as you mentioned Renamo, and arguably the origins of Renamo, which was a group that would oppose Frelimo after independence, was actually in South Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. I mean, before it became, yes, I mean, there is a sense that originally Renamo was created by members of South Rhodesian intelligence service before being taken on by South Africa. But that's a story for later, after independence. Overall, my point is to understand Cold War politics in Africa, to understand Cold War in Southern Africa more generally. And I do argue this in the book. You have to, if you want it or not, because it can be complex, you have to understand the specific regional African context.
Very much so.
Absolutely. So you talked about Mozambique being so connected, to South Africa. To understand everything around the story, even the origins of Frelimo, but also how this war unfolded, the relationships. You need to look at specific regional African context, geography of these places, right? Where they were based, where they were operating, So this context and the politics of African states is really crucial to understand the course of the anti-colonial wars, and also after independence, what happens with, unfortunately, civil wars, both Angola and Mozambique. So that context of African regional politics is crucial to understand what's happening in South Africa at the time, and to understand even the Cold War in the region. Sometimes I would say even more.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's a very good place to finish there. That's very interesting. So, Cold War liberation, the Soviet Union, and the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in Africa, 1961 to 1975. That's the book that we were talking about today. So, for listeners, how can they get hold of your book?
The book you can find online via the website of the University of North Carolina Press, and also on different online kind of resellers. But fortunately, you can also get the book for free.
Yes.
It's available with the support of the Mellon Foundation and the University of North Carolina Press. So you can find the book as a free ebook online.
Professor Telepneva, it was really nice to have you on, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for being on with us today.
Thank you very much.
That was Professor Natalia Telepneva. It was a pleasure to be able to talk to her and be able to learn more about the Soviet Union's interactions with Mozambique and other former Portuguese colonies in Africa. It's very interesting. Lately, I've developed an interest in the Cold War in Africa, and it's certainly interesting now today. There's a lot of talk about China, Russia, and the Western world competing in Africa now. So, I don't believe history repeats itself, but it rhymes. And obviously, we have to be careful about what comparisons we make. But the comparisons are interesting. Indeed. And nowadays, you don't really have so much the ideology necessarily. It's more about resources and development, and there is a little bit of rhetoric there as well. The Western side will say, well, they need to partner with us with the democracy and so stuff like that. That's what I would say. But the Cold War is a whole nother animal and whole nother beast by itself. So whether we're moving into a Cold War II or not, which I would sort of say that we are, is another story altogether. But Africa is definitely a very amazing place. There's a lot of rich history there, and it's a huge place as well. So even just scratching the surface of Portuguese Africa, so with Portugal's former colonies there. So I actually spent some time in Mozambique as well. It was amazing. And so it was really nice being able to learn a little bit more about the history of Mozambique with the help of Professor Telepneva. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. And I will sign off for now. But again, I will post I'll post the link of Professor Telepneva's book that we discussed in the show notes. And you can download it. I was able to download it. It's a good read. It's very detailed, and it's also doesn't get stuck in the weeds, I believe. Sometimes, books can be kind of hard to follow with a lot of things going on and everything, but I found that this book for me was really easy to follow, and it made a lot of sense. It didn't get distracted. It didn't lose focus or anything like that. It was a really good read. It was nice to look at. So I will attach that to the show notes, and I will leave you with this quick little message. In the meantime, I would like to say thanks, and I hope that everyone is doing fine and taking good care of each other. Bye-bye. Hello, listeners. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I sure hope that you've been enjoying the thoughts given in the Historical Thoughts and Interpretations episodes. But I would like to ask if you would consider making a pledge to the podcast via Patreon. I have many projects in mind for this podcast, and the books, paper, and so on needed to produce the episodes will not be free. Help keep Historical Thoughts flowing so that we can interpret the past and learn from it. You may pledge any amount that you like, and whatever you choose to give will be appreciated. If you would like to donate, go to my Patreon link at patron.podbean.com/historicalthoughts. And again, that's patron.podbean/historicalthoughts.